Hey guys, today we're doing a stat breakdown of the UFC Welterweight division, including knockouts, strike accuracy, submission, takedown defense, and at the end we'll crown the best striker in the division according to the stats and the statistically best grappler in the division. First, looking at the top 15, we have Edwards at champ, followed by Usman, Covington, Belal, Chimaev, Burns, Rahkmonov, Wonderboy, Brady, Neal, Luque, Magny, Chiesa, Garry, Pereira, and Della Maddalena. Looking at wins, we can see that Magny has 21 welterweight wins, which is the most in UFC welterweight history and 6th in all divisions in UFC history. Looking at losses, we can see the top 15 has a crazy 4 fighters that are undefeated in the UFC. We can also see that Usman has only 2 losses, which were both to Edwards. We can also see here that there are some crazy win-loss ratios. 5 fighters have win-loss ratios above 4, whereas 4 fighters don't even have a win-loss ratio because they are undefeated after 5 UFC fights or more. If we look at opponent win-loss ratio, we can see Usman and Edwards are at the top as expected, but Rahkmonov is 3rd, since he has fought legit guys on the way up, including Cowboy Oliveira, Geoff Neal, and Neal Magny. Whilst Garry is undefeated, currently his opponents have a win-loss ratio of less than 1, meaning his opponents on average lose more UFC fights than they win, although the way he just dismantled Daniel Rodriguez was very convincing. Looking at height in the division, we can see that all fighters are between 6'3" and 5'10". Something that I found interesting here, though, was Edwards is taller than Rahkmonov. I didn't know Edwards was so tall. If we look at reach, we can see some crazy outliers in this division. Magny has a reach of 200 centimeters, which is only 3 centimeters shy of former heavyweight champ Stipe Miocic. We can also see that both Rahkmonov and Luque have insane reaches for their height, with their reach spanning more than 10 centimeters more than their height. Now, onto striking. Looking at knockouts, we can see Luque is an absolute killer and has the 2nd most knockouts in UFC welterweight history. Usman also deserves special praise here, with 3 of his 4 knockouts coming in title defense fights. Lastly, it's insane that Chiesa is yet to record a UFC knockout after 17 UFC fights. Looking at knockout rates, we can see 2 young contenders land a knockout in 60% of their fights. I also found it interesting that Geoff Neal is 3rd in the division with underrated knockout power. Looking at knockout losses, there are an enormous 7 chins that have not yet been cracked in the UFC, and all the other fighters have either been knocked out once or twice. Top 15 fighters rarely get knocked out in this division. We can see that Usman averages the largest strike differential, and he does this against fighters with a win-loss ratio on average of 2, so against some crazy good competition. We can also see the bottom 2 top 15 fighters on average lose the striking differential, but they win their fights with their KO power. Luque has had 4 of 5 losses as decision, but 8 of 14 wins as knockouts, whereas Neal has had 2 of 3 losses as decisions, but 5 of 8 wins as knockouts. Taking a look at significant strikes landed per minute, Della Maddalena is insane, with the 4th highest in UFC history for fighters with 5+ fights. Just noting here, I'm also including his contender fight. But if we look at the top 5 fighters for this stat, they've all had a lot of short fights with rapid finishes, which means they don't have time to gas out and drop this number down, so that's why their numbers are a bit higher. It's also interesting to see that Edwards is one of the least active strikers in the division, despite being champ and an awesome striker. Looking at strike accuracy, Rahkmonov and Chimaev are on top, although a lot of their strikes have been ground strikes, which is easier to be accurate. We can see Garry has a crazy accuracy of 55%, which is enormous for a stand-up striker like himself. We can also see that Colby Covington strikes under 40%, which is insanely low for a top 15 fighter, especially a wrestler who gets ground strikes, which typically are more accurate. If we look at strike defense, Della Maddalena is on top again, with the 3rd highest defense in welterweight history, noting that GSP was number 1 with 73%. We can also see, similarly to my lightweight video, if you haven't watched it, check it out, that being a good wrestler seems to bump up the strike defense numbers. I'm not sure if this is because people drop their hands or they just don't get punched when they're wrestling. Chimaev's strike defense is really low due to his fight with Burns, but just note he had a perfect striking defense in 4 separate UFC fights. Onto the grappling stats now. Chiesa has the most submissions in the division, although note only 1 of them was at welterweight with the remaining at lightweight. We can also see Rahkmonov is already 8th in UFC welterweight history for submissions after only 5 fights, And if we look at submission rates, we can see how crazy Rahkmonov is, and I think he's well on track to get the UFC welterweight submission record, needing only 3 more submissions. It's also interesting to see that 3 of the most prominent wrestlers in the division have rarely landed a submission in their career, instead going for control time and strikes. Looking at submission losses, we can see that no one gets submitted in this division, which makes Rahkmonov's submissions even more impressive. Also, we can see that Magny has 5 submission losses, which is almost more than the rest of the top 15 put together. We can see that Khamzat is on top of takedown accuracy, but what I found interesting was the maximum amount of takedowns landed in a fight for him is 2, since he gets them down and ends the fight quickly. I was also surprised to see Pereira second, who despite his flashy striking and backflips, has landed 11 takedowns in 8 fights. Looking at takedown defense, we can see that Chimaev and Rahkmonov have perfect takedown defense, each defending 5 takedowns. We can also see that wrestling defense in this division is just crazy in general, with 7 top 15 fighters having a takedown defense greater than 85%. If we look at takedowns landed per 15 minutes, Covington is on top, which is insane since he's had 8 fights go the distance, so he can wrestle at a high pace endlessly. Also, the amount of fighters with solid wrestling in this division is crazy. 11 of the top 15 fighters average 1 takedown per 15 minutes, which is essentially 1 takedown per fight or more. Lastly, looking at control, we can see both Covington and Usman average more than 450 seconds of control time per fight, which is more than 1.5 rounds. You don't want to face these guys in a 3-rounder, let alone a 5-rounder. And now, time to crown the statistically best fighters in the division. The way I did this was for each of these stats on screen, I gave the best fighters 5 points, the second fighter 4 points, the third fighter 3 points, and so on, and then ranked the fighters based on their scores. In third place for striking, we have Khamzat Chimaev, who is 11th in knockouts, 7th in strike differential, 2nd in strikes landed per minute, 2nd in strike accuracy, and 16th in strike defense. In second place is Garry, who is 6th in knockouts, 2nd in strike differential, 3rd in strikes landed per minute, 3rd in strike accuracy, and 14th in strike defense. And lastly, the statistically best striker in this division is Della Maddalena, who is 6th in KOs, 3rd in strike differential, 1st in strikes landed per minute, 10th in strike accuracy, and 1st in strike defense, noting that some of his numbers are near UFC records. Now, moving on to the best grappler in the division. In third place, we have Colby Covington, who is 6th in submissions, 7th in takedown accuracy, 8th in takedown defense, 1st in takedowns landed, and 2nd in control time. The second best grappler, according to the stats, is Michael Chiesa, who is 1st in submissions, 3rd in takedown accuracy, 14th in takedown defense, 3rd in takedowns landed, and 4th in control time. And lastly, the grappling stat king is Khamzat Chimaev, and it's not even close, who is 5th in submissions, 1st in takedown accuracy, 2nd in takedown defense, 2nd in takedowns landed, and 10th in control time, only just because of how short his fights have been. That brings us to the end of this video. Let me know which division you'd like to see next, and also let me know of anything interesting you noticed from the graphs that I missed, and put it in the comments. And as always, like, share, subscribe, do all those good things, and I'll catch you next week for UFC 290.